Hello and welcome to the Fifth Goddess Lounge. Delighted to have you here. Just to say what I always say, thank you so much to the Arts Council for being our funders. And we have got all the funding for the artists, but we do need to make up a little bit of a shortfall. So Laura will put a PayPal link in the chat. And thanks also to our mentors, to Katrine Faber, who's here tonight from Singing Our Place Festival, to Jill Greenhalgh of the Magdalena Project, and of course, Mandy Curtis of 18 Hours and Hastings Storytelling Festival. So it's Climate Saving Goddess this month. And if the goddess is nature, then she's also the climate. And this episode is also about, or is completely about oneing with the climate, oneing being one with nature. And we've got some fabulous artists. We've got LAURA COPPIN, who's usually behind the scenes, but very much center stage tonight. She is a self-styled clown. She refers to herself as a crone and a Red Rebel activist. And we've got Katrine Faber, who's a storyteller, a performance artist, and founder of Teater Viva in Denmark. And Jo Blake, who's a dancer, theatre practitioner, performer, all the disciplines of arts all together. And last but very much not least, JULIET Russell, who is the goddess of all things vocal and founder of Vocal Explosion. So we realise that it's a massive subject, climate saving goddess. We're looking at this subject through the lens of 5 artists, but we're going to start with our perhaps most conventional, though she's anything but conventional, activist, LAURA COPPIN. So can we go straight to your film, Laura? I can't wait to see it.
I want to tell you a story, the greatest story never told, hidden between the lines of some of the most well-known stories in the world. Stories we are reliving as we speak. Tales of a garden of the gods date back to ancient Samaria and gave rise to the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, a paradise where the first humans lived in abundance and peace with all the creatures of the earth, and each could speak to the other. A paradise from which we were expelled for taking something that was not ours to take. What if I were to tell you that we never left Eden, that what we did instead was to sever our ties to it and tear it down, and that the few beasts who survived the destruction still speak? As David Attenborough said at Davos, the Garden of Eden is no more. We have destroyed it and ushered in a whole new age to call our own. An age full of horror, which in its bottomless greed is outpacing our planet's few previous great extinction events. An age where our actions in the next few years will dictate what happens over the next few thousand, if not millions. Even now, despite the untold destruction we have wreaked upon the paradise we once called home, we have some of our companions in Eden still clinging to life. It is our duty to see them for what they are, and hear the warnings that they have never stopped trying to give us. From this noble, dwindling contingent, there is a group whose words we hear the least, but on whose existence we depend the most: insects. Ancient cultures which ate insects or depended on them for medicine, resources, or guidance have them woven into their beliefs and even their language. Some groups of Aboriginal Australians exemplify this beautifully, using beetles to indicate the future abundance of yams and certain edible seeds, as well as when to harvest them, the length of processionary caterpillar trains to predict the severity of upcoming seasons, the singing of cicadas as an indication that plums are ripe and ready to be picked. They celebrated the abundance of insects both for themselves as well as the other creatures which fed on them, performing ceremonies to encourage their abundance and singing songs to honour them, even receiving songs in return from the insect's own ever-present ancestors through the dreaming or dream time, an in itself ever-present state of being and place that also represents the story of creation and the founding of their cultures. In ancient Egypt, the Scarab beetle was held sacred, and the Scarab god Capri was believed to roll the sun into the sky each day, and who, as an aspect of the sun god Ra, also represented the creation and renewal of life itself. It's impossible, of course, to discuss insects in ancient Egypt without referencing a story that has spread across the world and ingrained itself into our cultural consciousness. The 10 Plagues of Egypt, a not dissimilar tale, a story of humanity's punishment for their sins. Insects featured heavily in the 10 Plagues. Lice, flies, and the most famous of all, locusts. Before we continue, a little background is necessary for this story. I was lucky to grow up in rural Cheshire, and luckier still looking back to be largely avoided by other children for my angry diatribes such as "leave that worm alone" and "I will bite you if you tear off that ladybird's wings." My distinct lack of popularity amongst the human population was thankfully not mirrored by those of the other creatures around me, and I was lucky to have many souls I counted as my dear friends. The changes of the seasons were marked by explosions of life and colour, the thrum of bees seeking out spring's first blooms, the dangling splendour of clouds of courting St. Mark's flies, the whimsical twirling romances of cabbage-white butterflies, the heavy whir and unfortunate thunk of maybugs, the red sea of mating soldier beetles, the sudden scurrying terror of male house spiders out looking for love. Much of my time was spent fishing bees, flies and wasps out of buckets, topping up our water fountain so all could drink, and gently carrying out spiders and leaving them in warm nooks attached to the house. Sadly now we've decimated our insect population so thoroughly it's rare for me to see even a single specimen of those once merry hordes, though I never stop checking water containers and other secret traps for any souls in need of aid. Some of the most meaningful interactions of my life have been with insects, all of whom have thanked me in their own dear way. I nursed an exhausted honeybee for hours in Brussels several years ago, and it danced for me so beautifully that I was in tears, and so when I was invited to perform at an evening called Talking to Animals, I knew I had to honour her, and so Intersect was born. Even with this history, I never could have anticipated how a plague of locusts would change my life forever. If you saw the film I made with XANTHE for the wonderful Kitchen Goddess series she hosted for Hastings Storytelling Festival, you'll have seen me only days into this very journey. The day after an action breaking into a HS2 site to witness the screaming earth where ancient woodland had once stood, myself and Ben found ourselves in the grey embrace of Bexhill Retail Park. He had never been inside a certain large pet retailer, and to sate his curiosity, in we went. Exhausted and grieving, we were faced with a wall of screaming, desperate souls, trapped in tiny boxes with no food or room to move, beating their hands against the walls of their prisons. We left with as many boxes as we could carry. Thus began a mad dance of figuring out their care as we went, struggling to find any guides on how to care for them beyond the bare minimum it took to keep them alive. At first, they were in a small terrarium, pushed against the radiator in our kitchen for warmth. The tank you can see is a relatively late iteration in those early, blundering days. They were a range of ages, and all at first terrified of us, with a dash of curious suspicion as to why they had suddenly been delivered to this strange, new, but admittedly more comfortable place. At first, they warily peeked at us from every nook and cranny they could hide themselves in, slowly peering at us from ever closer hiding places as their curiosity overtook their fear. The first moments of communication began, and we soon realised they were very deliberately trying to speak to us. A lean to the side to say hello, an antenna drop to ask if they can approach. The moments we shared with them were fleeting but priceless. We began recording the patterns on the wings of the adults as they grew more trusting of us, giving each of them names. The real change came when we had to clean out their tank for the first time. We'd avoided handling them at all as we'd read that they hated it, and would emit a foul liquid if threatened. We decided we wanted to do it based on trust, and after explaining our intentions, let them choose to crawl into our hands. Many of them did, and when they realised that their home had been quite significantly refurbished, and many new delicious and locust-appropriate treats had been added, their communication entered a new realm of trust and enthusiasm. Whatever strange hulking beasts had taken them, they knew we wanted to help. From then, we were able to witness their tantrums and excitement, their joy and irritation. They approached us to say hello, and even came to us for help. They asked us constantly to come out for adventures, but also, we realised, to sunbathe. We hadn't got the basking lamps we bought them nearly close enough for their liking, and what we first took to be creeping attempts to escape were actually very determined attempts to splat gloriously in the heat. Over the course of our time with them, we realised they weren't trying to escape us at all. they just wanted to see the world. As we spent more time with them, we fell head over heels in love with every single one of their personalities. Their language is complex, a mixture of hand, mouth, mandible, arm, leg, antenna, abdomen and wing movements, a graceful and mostly silent ballet full of expressive emotion and depth. They began visiting us in half-awake states, their curious faces burning behind our eyelids. In a very dark moment they surrounded me, with a gentle but unerring pressure, and I found the same ring of them clustered at the front of the tank when I came over afterwards to thank them. I often wonder what songs they would sing in dream time. Each tank has its own unique personality. The girls with their quiet, goddess-like dignity, their remarkable snake-headed ovipositors, their gentle love and support for one another, their sense of justice, their fierce intelligence and joyful sense of adventure, all as different as one another, sharing their tank together with grace and only minor pettiness. Annie, ever pregnant, full of love and cripplingly jealous, craving only your undivided attention. Infinity, who suffered a bout of neurological problems which left her unable to control her limbs, but who became the most excited and adventurous climber of all, the first to leap with joy and beg to come out to play. Kanji, silly and playful but kind and empathetic, always offering a hug and support to those who need it. The boys, like marauding pirates or excited puppies, scrambling to greet us and trying to jump on us at every opportunity possible. Lusty, competitive beings who form writhing piles of bodies and drag orgy piles through absurd strongman feats, treating their bodies like demolition derby cars and leaving dismembered limbs in their wake. Machete, one of the most playful souls I've known in this life, a rotten flirt who gave unfathomable neck massages that felt like you'd been hit by an electric current. Noir, beautiful and otherworldly, wreathed in black and gold and hiding a noble heart and the soul of a pervert under a veneer of careful disinterest. Dread Pirate Roberts, a soul who truly lived up to his name, ending up peg-legged with an unabating desire, no matter the condition of his earthly vessel, to ride on your shoulder, playing endless silly pranks and games and showing a capacity for love I will carry with me forever. We've sadly lost many of the souls you've seen today. We lost so many in such a short space of time, after a remarkable run of 7 months with them in our lives, that I had to choose between making a locust costume for this film and being there with them in their final moments. No costume I could ever make could honour them if I did not walk with them to their end. The mark they have made on both our lives and those of all who met them will always remain. I love you all, and I miss you more than I could ever express. So how do these gentle, wildly sentient beings form a destructive force that can decimate entire nations and is feared the world over? The answer is that often they don't. There is no such thing as a locust, until some species of solitary grasshoppers change their neurology and physiology in a remarkable act of transformation and swarm. And when they do, it is our monoculture-led agriculture and destruction of the natural world and its climate which sends swarms spiralling into their trillions. Across North Africa and the Middle East, evidence shows that civilization after civilization has been toppled throughout history by localized, man-made climate change, directly caused by exploitative agriculture, deforestation, soil degradation and erosion, ending in the loss of plant and animal species, desertification and civilization collapse. There's evidence for this dating as far back as 7000 BC to Samaria, repeated over the millennia with leaders ignoring warnings of the doom their actions were bringing. We faced biblical locust plagues in 2020, and many fingers are pointing to climate change being behind the very specific conditions required for them to form. And what of the other plagues of Egypt? The Nile turning to blood? Algal bloom from manure making the already silty water too nutrient-rich, causing fish to die and frogs to flee, and flies and lice to bloom from the absence of predators and the glut of food from their putrefying corpses, bringing disease and pestilence in their wake. How many of the myths and stories we share of gods punishing the wicked come from disasters we have engineered ourselves? Could the story of the fall of Adam and Eve itself represent the desertification of the Middle East, spurred on by agriculture and our exploitation of our natural environment? We find ourselves now with a very clear choice. Change our ways or our civilization will fall, except this time we will take the rest of life on Earth with us, and they all want more than anything to have the chance to live. They will tell you that themselves, if you'll listen.
Wow, I just have to take an exhalation there because that was truly, truly, Laura, utterly epic. I'm going to watch it at least 16 more times. And I always said this in The Kitchen Goddess, I'm saying it now, you are the ultimate custodian of nature. You walk your talk, not just in your Red Rebel Brigade protests, but in the way you live. And you've already taught me so much about locusts, and it was lovely to see. I have seen them in your flat, but to see them so tiny and then getting bigger, and then their naming and the personalities, it was exquisite. Thank you so, so much. But this is, you've talked a lot about the climate there, and I just wanted to ask you, of all the protests you've done with the Red Rebel Brigade, is there one that you think is most relevant to this Goddess Lounge?
Yes, and it was actually one that in itself was very life-changing for me. So I'm just going to bring up the picture to show you all. It was for Indigenous Peoples Day, and I was very lucky to be involved in this protest. So it was against the deforestation of the Amazon, as well as against the deforestation from HS2. We worked with Indigenous tribes in the Amazon itself, as well as all the forest protectors who are living in these sites, to create this scene. I was very lucky to come and basically arrive and get to grieve. There's a lot of people who took some real risks to do this in Trafalgar Square. They had real stumps of the trees that had been dismembered. And this member of an Amazon tribe, forgive me, I sadly can't remember his name, but he said something that has stayed with me permanently, which is, I don't know what disease you have in the West that makes you want to kill your own mother.
That is extraordinary. And I know that for you, we're going to talk about the lament later, but for you, a key word in all this is consciousness, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. So it's one of these things that I really struggle to get my head around, because truly the only thing we can ever be sure about is consciousness itself. It's the only thing we experience. Everything else really is an educated guess. The only thing any of us can ever know is the inside of our own mind. And to then jealously guard that and to deny every other living thing on Earth as sort of guilty of not being sentient until proven sentient is absurd to me. And I think it's mankind's greatest sin. And I think it's where every ill we've visited upon the world comes from.
Yeah, well, I do think this concept of consciousness is key, absolutely key tonight. And I thank you so much, Laura. I want to go on now to KATRINE FABER, who also is making lots of explorations into consciousness, both hers and the outside world. She doesn't see them as any different really from each other. And her festival, Singing Our Place, is one of the inspirations for the Goddess Lounge. But it's part of a much larger project, isn't it, KATRINE? Can you just talk a little bit about your Singing Our Place project?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Laura, for the film. Yeah, the Singing Our Place project is it's a huge project where we do performances and sound installations and community plays and workshops and concerts and research into the dialogue with our living surroundings. And it's inspired by the voice, by singing, and by many traditions around the world where we have been or we are still doing singing to connect ourselves with our living surroundings, and singing improvised listening. So it's a way of connecting, interconnecting, using the sound and the singing together. So that's why I call the project Singing Our Place as a way of also saying that we try to honor our surroundings by singing with them and listening to them.
Yes, and I know we've just got one image because there are so many we could have chosen from, but just one of you working in Greenland. Could we see that?
Yeah, this photo is from northwest Greenland, where we have been working several years, and we work together with a huge group of locals and professional Inuit performers also. And this picture is from the ice fjord, where there's a very huge glacier that is melting very rapidly, very fast in this time. And we did several meetings with this place, and this picture is there. We're listening to and trying to respond to the place by improvising and singing without words, just singing and exploring all the ways that we can connect with the land through our voices.
Well, I know that you've really used improvisation and your response to this theme of climate saving goddess, but I do think we just need to put a little bit of context to the poetry that you're going to be using in the film. Can you talk a bit about the Voluspa?
Yeah, I use just a little part of the Voluspa, which also said, which is the oldest poem or the oldest tale that we have in the north, in Scandinavia and Iceland. And it is the old woman, the old crone, the old seeress or the oracle. She is seeing all times at the same time. She can see the past and the present and the future at the same time. And she's also able to see behind the limits that we have put between ourselves and our living surroundings, humans and animals and plants and trees and land. And she sings also this story of the huge cycle that we live in all together, the cycle of birth and life and climax and also destruction, Ragnarok as we call it in the north, and the destruction of everything, and the necessity of confronting this destruction in ourselves and in our surroundings also in order to come through and to be able to open us for new beginnings, new visions, new ways of being in the world. So it's a huge old poem about this cycle that we all belong to.
Well, that's beautifully put. Why don't we talk a little bit about your work with the human choir, the sound of human, and your work with lament? We're coming on to that after your film. But can you just talk to us about that and what you think the function of lament is?
Yeah, coming back to this, what the poem also tells about the grief of the catastrophe of the destruction, and that is for me very actual. That's why the poem is very actual in these times, because we are really facing a lot of reasons for grief and pain and sorrow, because there's such a huge destruction happening around us and because of us. So, and I think lament is a possibility to go through, to embrace this grief in order to release new energy and new hope and new life. And
Wow.
And I like to work with I have been working with the human voice for many years in many ways, in all the possible and impossible ways that the human voice can express itself. And I really like also to work with shouting and whispering and the breath and also the crying, which for me also is kind of a beautiful music also. And I think singing through grief, singing through the crying, lamenting the grief is also a possibility to sing all the colors of the soul.
Wow, fantastic. Let's look at the film. Thank you, Laura.
In the beginning, there was the nothing. There was no sand, no sea, nor cool little waves. Earth was not, nor heaven above, but a yawning gap, and grass nowhere. Would you know yet more? sun turns black. The earth sinks into the sea. The bright stars fall out of the sky. Flames torch the leaves of Yggdrasil. The heat plays high with the sky itself. The sun, the sister of the moon, from the south, her right hand cast over heaven's rim. No knowledge she had where her home should be. The moon knew not what might was hers. The stars knew not where their stations be. Would you know yet more? Would you know yet more? Garm howls loud before Gnipachiljer. The feathers will burst and wolf run free. Much do I know and more can see of gods, humans, nature in fight. Brothers shall fight, sisters shall fight and fell each other. The old tree sighs where the giant shakes it. Yggdrasil still stands, but it trembles. Hard is it on earth, axe time, sword time, wind time, wolf time. Ere the world falls, nor ever shall men each other spare. Would you know yet more? Would you know yet more? She was so tired. Life in the human civilization so exhausting. Yggdrasil, the tree of life, the axe of the universe, the spine of our body, trembling, muted. She decided to become an animal again, like the whales once upon a time who came up to the ground, to the land, and then returned to the ocean. She decided to find back her animal voice, her animal ear, the capacity to listen to the trees, the insects, the ground, the stone, the waters, the clouds, and the other animals. And I asked, "Where are you? My sisters, my brothers, my living surroundings. Where are you?"
sisters, my brothers, all living things in the world, I will go looking for you. I search you. My sisters, my brothers, all living things in the world. And she went into the world. Now do I see the earth anew rise all green from the waves again. The large waterfall sounds, and the eagle flies, and fish she catches beneath the cliffs. Would you know yet more? Would you know yet more?
Wow. Thank you, Katrina. What an amazingly important film. I just love the way you go through the whole gamut of emotions. And I know you live your life like that with great integrity. And whenever I've seen you prepare for a performance, do a performance, it's like a click of the fingers and you are right in that moment. And I have to say, I noticed that Laura's put in the chat that one of the locusts fell insanely in love with you and tried to crawl into the screen to get to you. You talked a little bit about lament before we showed your film, and I'd just like to bring Laura on so that we can get a sort of mirror of how Laura works with lament, because like you, she too's worked with it extensively.
Yeah, hi. I just want to say how beautiful that film is. Like, I find it stunning, and I can't tell you how many times in my life where I've wanted to do exactly that, and it really speaks to something really primal in all of us, I think, of what we should be doing. It's amazing. Yeah. So for me, it's quite a transcendent experience connecting with grief. So the Red Rebel Brigade was founded by Doug Francisco, and it represents the blood of all the lives that have and will be lost due to climate change and human action. And so you are already representing this tide of grief. And as you walk, you know, people, we always cry and are in tears, and it's a very emotive thing anyway. But for me, because I have fibromyalgia and some other joint problems, generally quite quickly into a performance, which we can be out for more than 6 hours with no comfort breaks, quite quickly in, I get into quite extreme amounts of pain, particularly from the controlled movements. And the only way to kind of get your head into it is to just connect that with the pain of the earth and the pain of all the creatures you share it with. It's that jagged grief, and you know that it's the spirit of the earth that's screaming, and you internally scream with it. And I tend to do sort of mantras in my head, inviting my ancestors and all the spirits of the earth to bring me their rage and their grief and their pain, so I can channel it into what I'm doing. And I know a lot of people use similar methods, and I think that's why it's such an effective mode of performance art.
Amazing. We really are going very deep tonight. Juliet, your singing has a similar effect to Katrina's film and to when we hear about Laura's lamenting as part of the Red Rebel Brigade. But do you have anything to say, to add to this subject of lament?
Yeah, as a singer, I love working with drones, and I'm not alone in that. And I see a lot of people responding to drones, and often what we do is respond with lament. And I've seen some extraordinary group activity working with drones and lament. And often, as Katrine was saying, going into the space of using no known language, just sound, so that you're almost bypassing that part of the brain and coming from the heart. A really primeval thing, and actually fabulous when you can give yourself permission to do it.
Mm-hmm. Wow, a primeval thing, and we're going to be moving on to the heart. And Jo, I know for you as a dancer, and you know, you described the performance, the live performance you're going to do for us quite shortly, as kind of a postcard and also a poem. And we have had conversations before about rhythm, and I know lament is often rhythmic. It's to do with the breath, knowing what you're doing, getting yourself into a kind of state Celtic mythology. We'd have my grief, I to be living, he to be dead. Once they were as strong as a mountain, now there's nothing left of us but a shadow. And it just keeps repeating and repeating till we go to that place. What about rhythms and cycles? Have you got a view on that?
Well, I mean, I think we've touched on some of those cycles. I think Katrine's amazing video touched on those cycles of that. You know, there seems to be something quite inherent in our human experience, which involves a natural turning in, you know, a going inwards, a turning in, a dissolving, to then refind, and then something else being born. So that kind of death and rebirth cycle seems really inherent to our experience of what it is to be human. And it tells us that death is a necessary part of life.
Yes, and also I know that Laura sometimes, I don't know whether you mentioned it there, Laura, whether I zoned out, talks about transcending pain, you know, kind of getting into an ecstatic state, as it were. And I couldn't help thinking that with Katrina, she went so deep in that film, which meant that the joy was so explosive at the end and delightful. We'd love to, I know you've got lots to say about inner work, but should we just go straight to your performance, please?
Yes. I mean, you know, we started with locusts in quite a kind of biblical fashion, and we're gonna carry on. And you know, the themes of suffering and are inherent in part of this story that I'm going to tell you. But I had wanted things to be a little bit more organized than they are. You see, I'm in a bit of a mess here because I wanted to introduce to you Mary Magdalene. But she's a bit unraveled. She's kind of in a bit of a tangle these days. It's kind of difficult to work out where Mary begins and where she ends. See, Mary Magdalene, I'm not even that sure what she's doing here. I mean, what does Mary Magdalene have to say about climate? Well, she has something to say about the climates inside. That's what she called them, these states of being that separate us from the good. These she called the climates, but she's not a goddess, is she, Mary Magdalene? I mean, she was just a woman. You know, she didn't give birth to the seasons or name the animals, and flowers didn't bloom in her footsteps. She was just a woman who witnessed a death and had a gospel that never made its way into the Bible. Or it did, but then it was ordered to be removed in 367 AD. She was just a woman who witnessed a death, who had a gospel that was ordered to be destroyed, but it wasn't completely. 3 copies have been found, all of them in Egypt. She was just a woman whose gospel was buried under the ground and laid there like a seed for 2,000 years and sprouted in 1895. She was just a woman with a gospel that laid into the ground like a seed and sprouted in 1895, 3 copies found, buried in Egypt, and all of them with the first 6 pages torn out and the same 4 pages missing in the middle. She was just a woman whose gospel was buried, found, partial. And when they tried to print it, there was a flood and all of the manuscripts were washed away. So they tried again. And the First World War broke out. And so the manuscripts lay on a shelf unread and unseen. So they tried again. World War II broke out. The manuscripts stayed on a shelf unread and unseen. And in 1955, they finally made their way into the hands of the public. She was just a woman who loved, who witnessed a death, who fell through death into life, who had a gospel that was buried for 2,000 years and then rose again. Why? A room filled with 12 men, the disciples. There's Peter, there's Andrew and Levi, and all of them are draped around in various postures of morose grief. Their teacher is dead. Jesus has been hung from the cross, his body taken away. And at this point, in this room where the 12 disciples gather, at this moment, there is no such thing as Christianity. There are no churches, no bishops, no synods, no cathedrals, no minsters. There's no Bible. There's no doctrine. There are no crusades. There's just 12 men in a room having witnessed the death of their teacher, the teacher with whom they threw in all of their lot. And then the door opens. Mary comes in, and she carries with her this skirl of wind. Leaves dance around her ankles, and she has inside of her this light, the same kind of light that he had. And such is the power of this light in her that it makes Peter stand up. Peter looks at Mary and he says, "Sister, we know that the Saviour loved you above all other women. Tell us the words of the Saviour that you remember, the things that you know that we don't because we haven't heard them." And Mary says, "I will teach you." All that is born, all that is created, all the elements of nature are interwoven and connected with each other. All that is born, all that is created, all the elements of nature are interwoven and connected one with the other. All that is composed will be decomposed. Matter returns to the origins of matter. Everything returns to its origins, to its roots. There is no such thing as sin. There is only the sin that is the habit. When you fall into corruption, this is why the good has come amongst your midst, to remind you of the goodness at your core. All the elements of nature, everything that is connected, interwoven one with the other. Mary watched as his body was taken down from the cross, limp and heavy and lifeless. All the other disciples had fled. They couldn't bear it. They saw the nails, the hammer, they heard the cries, and they ran in fear. But Mary stayed. She watched as he was carried through the streets, the crowds parted. She followed the small entourage to a cold stone tomb. And there he was laid down on a stone table. His arms folded neatly at his side, his hands were the wounds still dry with blood, the hands that had held her. She sat in the silence of the tomb. The candles flickered, the frankincense burnt, the blood already drying on his brow. She gently disentangled the hair from the crown of thorns around his head. All of the other disciples left. She watched as the stone was rolled across the doorway. She watched to the last minute when the sight of him disappeared. But Mary didn't leave then. She sat down outside the tomb. She closed her eyes and she wept. And through her veins, a darkness like oil began to run. She became slick with it, a heavy darkness. The tears that she cried were thick black. The oil so thick around her, the darkness so thick that it glued her feathers, her wings to her body. So heavy was she with darkness. This was the first climate. And as she became slick, black oil pouring down the hillside in her grief, over the top of it, there came a flame. The flames of her rage began to burn up the oil. The flames began to dance across the surface of the oil slick that she was in her grief until it all accumulated in her throat, a thick, dark, black coal, burning hot, too big to swallow, too big to cough up. This was Mary's rage. Why me? Why him? Why here? Why now? She felt the fire racing through her body and tore down all the virgin forest of her. All that was living was wiped away, until she found herself sat in a landscape scoured black and dead. And in that place, there was silence. No birds, no insects. And as she sat there, she felt the tectonic plates underneath her start to rumble. Something beneath her started to shift. A mountain began to grow from out underneath her, and it lifted her up. And for a moment she lay on the peak of the mountain and she breathed in the cold air. And the sun was beautiful up here. And the more she lay in the sun, the more she started to forget. And it was wonderful to forget, because down there the oil glugged away, but she couldn't hear it. And down there, the forest was burnt to a crisp, but she couldn't see it. In fact, up here, she couldn't even smell the bitterness in the air because the air was clear. But then the mountain started to shift. The stones began to crumble. And Mary fell too. For 3 days and 3 nights, crying. But inside, the climates tumbled and tore at her. But Mary did not flee from them. On the morning of the 4th day, as she sat in her wilderness, her barren land, she felt something tickle in her toes. She looked down, and there at her feet, there was a tiny white flower. As she bent closer to smell it, the seeds from the flower flew through the air into her mouth and landed in her heart. And at that moment, she heard a voice. Mary. Teacher, she said. She saw a figure standing in front of her. Do not cling to me, Mary, he said. Like water becomes ice, becomes steam. I am not gone, I am just changed. This is the love that does not die. Split a piece of wood, and you will find me. Lift a stone, and I am there. Mary looked at the figure in front of her and she said, I see you now in a vision. Tell me, how is it I see you? Is it with the soul or the spirit that I see you? Christ laughed. He said, Mary, how wonderful you are that the sight of me does not frighten you. It is neither with the soul nor the spirit that you see me, but the place where the two meet, here, in the eye of the heart. And it is here that pages 4 to 6 are missing. So we'll never know what Christ was about to say to Mary about the eye of the heart. But we do know that Mary Magdalene wrote a gospel. And some part of me believes that in the great narrative of this world, those 2,000 years of its dormancy was actually a gestation beneath the ground. Back then, there weren't the ears to hear, but now, perhaps we do have those ears to hear. May we walk in Mary's footsteps, and may the flowers bloom where we walk.
Oh, it was very atmospheric. It was lovely to have something so live and so present, and also so now. I'm just intoxicated by that story. For some reason, I've never really looked at those Gnostic Gospels or Mary's Gospels, and I'm just intrigued by this number 7. Did you say that the Gospel starts on page 7, or?
Yes. Yeah, the Gospel starts on page 7 with the question, "What is the origin of matter?"
Wow, that's fantastic. And I love this idea that this page is missing. And I know we could say it's sort of patriarchy, but I also think that maybe somebody thought those pages that were going to come were so precious, they tear them out and put them in the, equivalent to a 2,000-year-old bra and sort of run off with them. So I hope it was that rather than something awful. But the time is now, and you've brought it to us. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the other artists, is anything being triggered for you listening to that extraordinary performance?
Yes, thank you, Joe. It was so strong and so touching. Really, thank you. And I must show you something from my process with my film that I think you will like, because I have 3 parts. I was meditating with clay through the process with the film, and first I made this, which is the pew form, and somebody is struggling to not to go into the transformation process, resisting the transformation process, as we all do sometimes. And then this quiet, long period of pupae of silent transformation. And then, which I would like to give you as a gift, if I could do it through the screen right now, but this is then the third phase, the new life with the eye of the heart. So this is for you. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah.
That's utterly fantastic. What synchronicity. And Joe, you made it really clear there that there's this big connection between the climates, and the 7 of them, again, that number 7 climates inside and the climate outside. And I know you've got a view on why we're in this climate crisis.
Well, it really connects with what Laura said earlier about the Brazilian man that she met at the activism. Struggling to find my words, but yeah, at the protest, and what is the sickness that makes us treat our mother in this way? And so for me, from one perspective, you can view Mary Magdalene as a climate activist, because she was somebody that really stayed with the difficult climates inside. And I think it's so apparent that anything that happens out there is only a result of what is in here. So if there's abuse happening and out there, it's because there's some kind of inner schism here. So a aspect of climate activism has to be doing the inner work. It has to be about integrating all the aspects of herself and going into those very difficult and uncomfortable places. And I think Mary Magdalene really knew how to suffer well. There's a good way to suffer and a bad way to suffer. And I think she
she knew how to suffer well and to ride it through, to get to the life that follows. Yeah.
And I know that this is part of a larger piece called The Witness that is coming, you're going to get out into the world in December. So we just can't wait to see that. But to me, I know you don't like to say she's a goddess, but she clearly is to me. And I know as part of The Witness, you talk about the seven demons inside Mary and how she's there's so many different Marys, isn't there? There's Mary the mother, Mary the prostitute, Mary the one who's got 7 demons cast out of her. And you think she's more of a priestess, don't you?
Well, I do. I think she's a priest. I think if Mary Magdalene existed, she was probably a priestess that was deeply connected to the Isis lineage, which is why there was such fondness for her gospel in Egypt and why it's there that it survives. And I also wonder about her own sacred knowledge in terms of what her and Christ were able to achieve together. So the reason why the piece is called The Witness is because I think that she provided that witnessing gaze to complete his initiation, which was a kind of cosmic initiation. So I think that what they achieved was because of the two, whereas it's been reduced to the one, and that's what needs to be changed.
Yeah, you sometimes talk, don't you, about bringing her back into the temple, bringing all her feminine sides, her goddess sides. That's what we need to I suppose, reinvigorate some forms of Christianity, if I may say so. Yeah. But I'd just like to move on to the final film, which is my film. And I love that, what Jo's been talking about, because she talks about 7 and she talks about Christ and Mary, and that in a sense that they are consorts to each other, like in all the early goddess myths we've looked at, and that Christ is the custodian and the shepherd as well. And we are custodians and shepherds. And this motif repeats and repeats and repeats. And it's going to repeat in a little Sussex folk tale once I've blurred on a little bit with an introduction. So Laura, could we start that Seven Sisters film?
It's a wild day, an Artemis day. Some of the Greeks believed that Artemis was an umbrella name for all the world's earth goddesses, from Ishtar to Isis. Her footprints, handprints, paw prints are all over the forest. She is the forest. She's the midwife, birthing cubs and pups, and she's the swift death bringer with her silver arrows. And yet, although she's the hunter, she's also the hunted, the beast that sacrifices itself to give food. In Greece, in a place called Broron, young girls used to dress as bears and do bear dances in honour of Artemis, imitate the movements of the bear, the sound of the bear, just so they could access their inner. This would be good because it would help them through their female rites of passage, but it wasn't just that. It was to connect them with the bigger rar out there, so that they would become custodians, shepherds of that wild. There's a statue of Artemis. She's covered with, some people say eggs, some people say breasts, some people say bull's balls, some people say sacks of pollen. But I think probably they are all those things, and that this statue is meant to spin, and as it spins, the eggs hatch, the breasts give milk, the bull mates, and the bees spread pollen. Because Artemis is that central spinning principle. There's another statue of her, and it's just a column, and then there's an image of her on one side and Hecate on the other side. Now, Hecate is the mistress of the crossroads. She's the central point of everything, and she's an avatar of Artemis. She has a strophalos, and the strophalos is a sapphire surrounded by a golden ball attached to a leather rawhide thong. And when Hecate spins it, it makes the sound of wild beasts laughing, or the wind. And the idea is that if you could see past this animal chaos, you can hear the music of the spheres, because on that leather thong are secret numbers that activate all the numbers of creation so that they all sing together. Because it's rumoured that Hecate and Artemis gave every living being a pin code, a secret number, and we are programmed to resonate with each other. Although all goddesses, before they get their names and forms, are animals that I think that Artemis is mainly bee, because she's so fierce, so sacrificial. And we heard in the last Goddess Lounge how bees, queen bees, when they hatch, sting each other to death so that only the strongest survives for the good of the hive. And apparently they sing in G. And I believe that that buzzing gives them an ecstatic sensation so that they don't feel the pain of the stinging. It's all for the good of the hive. And we know that when the queen bee is appointed, she mates with the drone and then she tears him to pieces and he sings. And probably he feels no pain. And I think we could learn from those bees because we need something, don't we? We need some kind of vibration that will make us fall in love with nature. And Seema Anand told us last month that when bees are happy, they sing in collective A. If we could learn that note, that vibration, maybe we could get ourselves into such an ecstatic state of being in love with nature like we did when we were children, like those girls that did bear dances, that would dull the pain and help us sacrifice what we need to sacrifice, our addiction to our fossil-fueled, plastic-filled way of life. If we don't, we're dicing with our own existence. And talking of a die, 6 sides. The opposite sides add up to 7. So 2, the opposite side will be 5, 3, the opposite side will be 4, 1, the opposite side will be 6. Where is the secret 7, the 7th face, that hidden facet? 7 is a wild number, an Artemis number. It's that axis, that spinning axis, that energy throughout all of nature that we have to be shepherds of, custodians of, to cherish. Honeycomb, central hexagon, surrounded by 6 hexagons. And the Pleiades, the 7 sisters, are Artemis's constellation. These cliffs behind me are known as the 7 sisters. There's Rough Brow, Haven Brow, Short Brow, Brass Point, Bailey's Hill, Flagstaff Brow and Went Hill. There was once a shepherd who worked the sweeps and folds of these downs. He had a belt with 3 buckles for his 3 good qualities. He was kind, he was true, and he was connected to the land. He loved every blade of grass, every insect wing. One day he lost a sheep and all day went searching for it and only found it towards evening where it was stumbling over the edge of the cliff called Rough Brow. He caught it just in time, arm around its soft middle. And as he did, a bee began buzzing in front of him. And he was electrified by that vibration and followed the bee. But the strange thing was, the further away the bee buzzed, the louder it became. And it landed on the next cliff, Haven Brow, and took the shape of a woman with hair as black as the back of a bear, and she was dancing with movements like a snake. And when night fell, she called down a star and it began to dance with her, and then another and another and another, because each of the stars that fell became women. The shepherd, intoxicated by the sound, looked straight at her and she caught his eye and seemed to gesture. With the sheep under this arm, he ran into the circle, took her under the other arm, but as he did, the women that had been stars became beasts. With fangs, teeth, claws, they began to rip, tear, sting, but he was totally oblivious. He ran out of the circle, took the woman all the way to his hut, sat her by the fire, said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me. It was some kind of enchantment." She said, "I called you. Let me think if I'll stay." And she watched him in silence for 3 days. And in that time she saw he had 3 good qualities. He was kind, he was true, he was connected to the land. And so she said, "All right, I'll stay with you on one condition. Never mention my dancing, never mention my sisters, keep the secret." And he promised, and she stayed. If time were a line of bunting, we could abseil down it. And as flags became feathers and ribbons became bones, we could attest that from the shepherd's time to this, there has never been a man more in love than him. He was over the moon, he was inside out, not a shred of doubt, not an ounce of fear. For days that seemed weeks, weeks that seemed months, it was an eternal summer. But when the harvest was brought in, he woke up one morning and she wasn't there. First hour he was okay, fed a sheep. Second hour, all right, chopped wood. Third hour, panic, started to tramp through branchy wood and boggy ditch. No sign. He returned exhausted, depleted, hair matted with sweat, jaw set, walked into his hut, and there she was sitting by the fire. Where have you been? I'm here now. You left me. You were dancing with your sisters, weren't you? And as he took his hands away from his face, she was gone. Not a whirl of a skirt, not a whiff of perfume. He picked up his shepherd's crook and he started to search, from rough brow to haven brow to short brow to brass point to Flagstaff brow to Bailey's Hill to Went Hill. Nothing. He walked a lifetime into his feet, and only then, one night, did he see, like fireflies flickering on a silver string, the 7 women dancing, singing. But this time, when he went into the circle, he didn't take her away. He danced with her. And when her 6 sisters changed into beasts, tore him, clawed him, stung him, he let them tear his flesh until it turned to feathers, his bones until they turned to stones, and he felt nothing except an ecstasy, a buzz. And if you really want to find out what happened to the true shepherd, just lie on your back at night and look at that constellation, 3 stars that we call Orion's belt, because that's him. She took him up there. It used to be called the true shepherd, right next to the Pleiades, but you only ever see 6 stars. Why? Because the 7th, the secret face, that other mysterious facet, is deep inside every one of us. And wherever you are, if you're in the city, if you're inside, you can still call down your sisters and dance and feel that that zzz, that Artemis wild.
Fantastic, Juliet. And I see Caroline coming there, who I think was at a storytelling last night. It might be 4 a.m. in the morning or something like that for her, where she is, was dancing with us. So that's wonderful. what amazing, amazing soundtrack. Thank you. They're totally improvised, especially for this Goddess Lounge, Juliet. And I know you've got an album coming out, haven't you, very soon? Can you tell us the title of it?
Yes, I've got an album called Vox Salva, which is the Latin for The Voice Survives, which felt really appropriate at this point after the last year. And a lot of the music on that is really inspired by the natural world, a lot of it in my own made up language. And there's one piece, Plasticus, which is really about how we need to become ambassadors for our earth again.
Yes, I know you're doing something called an environmental pledge, aren't you? And we'd love to be involved in that. Could you tell us a bit more about it?
I'd love to. The idea of the pledge to the land and the sea is to create a very positive collective consciousness by writing or recording just one simple sentence on how we can reduce our environmental impact and how we can become custodians and ambassadors for nature again. And all pledges will be added to the pledge book, which will just keep growing.
Fantastic. Before we do that, other performers here, any tips on pledges or pledging as a concept?
Hello, so I might jump in here a little bit because I do think this is a realm where we've been burdened with a lot of guilt and shame and unnecessary personal responsibility for the catastrophe we're in. So fossil fuel companies and other polluting companies have gaslit us for decades by basically saying it's your fault for using straws, when actually there's about 100 companies causing most of the world's emissions. So we need to kind of reclaim the idea of personal responsibility from them and remember that we are powerful individually and collectively, and we can make change even if we weren't the ones who brought this on us.
Yes. And what positive change would you make, Laura? What would what's going to be
I think one of the best ways is, we have a lot of direct consumer choices, but one of the hidden ways is what our finances are doing. So these companies actually depend a lot on subsidies from pensions and other investments. So who you bank with, what your pension is invested in, all these different things make a huge difference. And there's some really good tools online as well. There's actually a really good small independent bank called Triodos that invests in green things as well, as one example, but there's a few, and just find what's best for you.
Thank you. And Juliet, any recommendations? What kind of things are people putting in the pledges? All sorts, everything from not sort of having single-use plastics to a very conscious planting program, lobbying MPs, lobbying large corporations. And actually, one of the most moving ones was a woman saying, I want to change the way I perceive my relationship with my earth. So all sorts of angles and takes on this, businesses too. And also being an ambassador to share this and asking friends, family, your local businesses to make a pledge. It plants the seed, as Joe said. Yes, seeds are important. Juliet, thank you so much. And thank you. I know you did the soundtrack for Joe as well. We want to end with your track, Plasticus. You're not going to do it live because this is one of the tracks on your album. If people feel like putting pledges in the chat now, we will give them to Juliet. The link will go in the chat. You might want to use this just as a chance to breathe out. We've had some intense material tonight. But yes, just remember the words of Greta Thunberg, no one is too small to make a difference, so no matter how small the pledge. But no obligation to pledge, just we'll just go out with Juliet, and then that will be the formal end of the Goddess Lounge. You feel free to go, but we will be taking questions and answers for 5 to 10 minutes after that. So let's just hear Plasticus. It's a very short and very beautiful track.
Mother, Father God, we have forsaken you, plundered and burned from the garden, we cannot breathe, and all fellow creatures, we have forgotten you. The sacred trust has been deceived. Glorious dwellers of the sea, we have demoted you. Plasticus and poisons rot in the deep.
Thanks so much, Juliet. So please do raise a hand if there's any questions or things you want to raise or talk about. The artists are all here. Oh, well,
I just want to say how beautiful that song is, Juliet. It's just absolutely stunning. It's a hymn and a lament and a prayer all at the same time, and it's so moving.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it has been a full hour and a half. Thank you very much for staying with us, and thank you. Next month, it's Oracle Goddess, and we've got Livia Gaudencio and Bernadette Vallely and Anna Lines, and it looks set to be another fantastic evening. But great to see you go well, and thank you so much. I'd like to give a round of applause to all the artists, and especially, you know, everybody here has created unique work, especially for this. So thank you so much. Right, I think we can end.
We can. Thank you all. And I think I'm going to sort of jump in and speak on behalf of Juliet there. But if you think of a pledge later, do please still get in touch with us, send them over. We would love to hear them, because this is a chance for us to do something huge together.
Yes, and we'll put a link again in the survey that'll follow. And if you took the link is on Juliet's Vocal Explosion website. Thank you and good night.
Yeah.